Good evening and welcome. I'm Nathan Stretch and I'm the Division Manager of Community Development for Kitchener Public Library, and I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's 85 Queen author event. This evening is part of the City of Kitchener's Imagine It programming. We appreciate the city's ongoing support, allowing us to bring award-winning and internationally known authors and speakers to Kitchener. Special thanks goes to Lauren Morocco, the Director of Publicity for HarperCollins Canada, who is with us tonight. We appreciate your assistance and working with us to coordinate tonight's event. At this time, I'd like to introduce tonight's special guests, after which I'll invite them on stage for a chat. Born in Dublin in 1969, Emma Donoghue is a novelist, screenwriter, and playwright. Although Emma works in many genres, she is best known for her fiction, which has been translated into over 40 languages. Her awards and accolades are many, and I invite you to visit her website to read the extensive list that includes Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, Commonwealth Prize for Fiction, Canadian Screen Award for Best Adapted Screenplay, and Irish Film and Television Academy Award for Best Screenplay. Donoghue's fiction ranges from the contemporary, stir-fry, hood, landing, touchy subjects, akin, to the historical, Haven, Slammerkin, The Sealed Letter, Ashtray, Frog Music, and includes 2 books for young readers, The Lotteries +1 and The Lotteries More or Less. And before Emma takes to the stage, I'd like to read a short review from the Washington Post. Emma Donoghue is among the most fearless contemporary novelists we have, an immensely talented writer who is a great storyteller, and based on her extensive body of work, unafraid of subjects that give her less courageous peers pause. Welcome, Emma. Janet Somerville taught literature for 20 years in Toronto. She spent 3 years wholly immersed in Martha Gellhorn's life and words. Yours, for probably always, Martha Gellhorn's Letters of Love and War is her first book, available also as an audiobook read by Ellen Barkin. Her memoir, How Midsummer Night, will be published in April 2024. Janet appears in conversations with authors for bookstores, publishers, libraries, and writers' festivals, and frequently contributes to the Toronto Star's book pages, including one on August 29th about Emma's book. We are thrilled to invite Janet to our stage now to follow up from that phone interview with Emma. Welcome, Janet.
I'm so appreciating the cool club lounge vibe, by the way. I do a lot of events, I do a lot of library events, and it's not usually like somewhere you'd expect Drake to drop by. So all hail to 85 Queen Street.
Well, I already know what a delight Emma is to speak with. We spoke at length on the phone before I wrote the piece about this absolutely gorgeous novel learned by heart. And I'm hoping that you'll enjoy what she has to tell you about it tonight. I'm sure you will. So first thing, Emma, I was wondering if you would tell everybody how you got interested 30 years ago in Anne Lister, how she came into your life and how Anne Lister led you to Eliza Reign.
I was escaping from a rain shower, ducked into a bookshop, and, my eye automatically went to a Virago Press spine with the little apple on it, and it was the first volume of excerpts from the diaries of Anne Lister, a woman I'd never heard of. If Anne Lister had not been a raging lesbian of the 19th century, I feel her diary, which some say is the longest in the English language, would many decades ago have appeared in a multi-volume edition from a university press. But because of its scandalous content, Anne invented her own code to mask the sexual parts of her diary and also some stuff she was embarrassed about in other ways, like money issues, not having enough money or mending her clothes. So she used a code for about 15% of her diary. And because of the scandalous content, her diary has been mostly unpublished for hundreds of years. But now, through the wonders of the internet, and in particular, the fandom of the TV show Gentleman Jack, hundreds and hundreds of volunteers have been transcribing digital scans of the diaries. The digitization project, by the way, was funded by showrunner Sally Wainwright from a screenwriting award that she won. So, usually you think of there being an archival source and then, maybe a screenwriter uses it and fans passively wait for an entertaining show. But in this case, it's kind of a virtuous feedback loop. All these different people, from archivists to screenwriters to fans, are helping to bring the Anne Lister diaries to the public. Anyway, so I wrote my first play based on those Anne Lister diaries of her 20s, back in my 20s. But what I could never quite forget was that in her diaries, which she started in her 20s, Anne Lister would drop these references to poor Eliza, visiting Eliza, bringing cakes to Eliza. And Eliza Raine was her first lover, first of about 12. Nobody ever seems to have said no to Anne Lister, by the way. So Eliza Raine was, unlike all the others, she was a highly unusual figure in early 19th century Yorkshire. She was a biracial heiress who had been sent from India at the age of 6 by her father, a British man, away from her Indian family and completely cut off from them. And she was at boarding school in York at 14, when she was assigned to share an attic room called The Slope with just one other girl, Anne Lister, who was a persistent rule breaker, outrageously gender non-conforming young Yorkshire woman, very brilliant, very self-educating, just full of mental and physical energy. And the two girls fell madly in love. And this is all from a period before the Anne Lister diaries start, and even from before we have any letters. So in a way...
So I'm just going to interrupt and say that that's 1805, so you can... I'm hesitant to interrupt you, Emma, once you get on it.
No.
Right? But,
no.
But that was they met in 1805 in York in the King's Manor School, which was a school for girls. Sorry.
So, yes, no, it's funny that the basic points you forget to mention when you're lost in the detail. Yeah, so, several decades after writing my play about Anne Lister in her 20s, I felt driven to go back to the very beginning of her story and try and work out what could have happened to her at 14 that set her on this course. And I would say the main thing that changed in the decades where I was sort of inching towards writing this book is that more and more I was interested in Eliza Raine, maybe because Anne Lister has now been able to have her say, not only in the diaries, which are available online, but in a TV show. She's become this sort of iconic figure, stomping across the Yorkshire moors in her top hat. Whereas Eliza Raine is deeply mysterious and had a very tragic life after their love affair broke up. So by the time I came to write it, I tried it from the point of view of each of them. I thought I would go between the two, but it ended up that Eliza Raine was the one I was most interested in following, because hers was the unheard voice. There's a lot about Anne Lister in it because Eliza Raine is madly in love with her, but it ended up being Eliza's book. So that was something that surprised me.
And this is, an imaginative image of Eliza, too, on the cover. Now, Eliza, as Emma mentioned, was born in Madras, and she was the daughter of an East India Company man. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how this was fairly common for the East India Company white Brits to have wives, Indian-born wives.
Yeah, although, as I say, the Indian side of Eliza's life was really deliberately lost. Her mother died. She was cut off from her family. So we don't know, was her mother, Muslim or Hindu or Sikh. We know nothing about her. But we do know the gigantic cohort that Eliza was part of, which is, yes, the children of East India Company men. And that was the biggest corporation in the world, and it was really the mechanism by which Britain kept a stranglehold on India from roughly the mid-18th century to the mid-19th. So it was inconceivably big and rich and had a much bigger army than Britain had. And Eliza is one of hundreds of children who these British men had in India, often in very, comfortable and solid marital style relationships, which, however, didn't have any status under British law. So Eliza turns up in Britain at 6, and to me is such an appealing figure because she was such a mixture of good and bad cards that she'd been played, basically, in that she had a fortune. She had £4,000 sitting in the bank. She was extremely beautiful. Anne Lister said Eliza Reign was the most beautiful girl she ever met. She sounds very intelligent and thoughtful in her letters. But on the other hand, she was illegitimate and she was brown in a city, York, not London at all, where she would have been one of the only ones.
And her older sister, Jane, was one of the only other ones, right?
That's right, and
little girls.
And they do not seem to have got on. So Eliza was under the guardianship of one of her father's friends. And it's interesting, when we do start getting some letters from Eliza in the archives, she sounds really tense. She sounds like, I must please all my teachers. I must please the headmistress. I must get all my homework done. And I'm thinking, no wonder she had to really play by all the rules, because you're not allowed to be a maverick and, a rebel if you're also the one racialized kid at the school. It makes absolute sense to me that she tried to tick all the boxes and get it right. But of course, she fell madly in love with this natural rebel figure, Anne Lister. So it was a real meeting of opposites there. And by the way, the only reason that we have letters from Eliza Reign at all is that they were preserved in Anne Lister's archives, relatively a handful, like less than 100 letters between the two of them. And I was only able to get these through the kindness of volunteer transcribers. So they had not been transcribed like all the Anne Lister diaries had. So I basically reached out to one researcher and said, how can I get these letters? And she put together a team of 14 volunteers and they transcribed them for me, like comma by comma.
And because so much of this work you were doing, the research for this book at least, was during COVID lockdown, pandemic lockdown, right? And so where before you could have gone to Shibden Hall, which is where Anne Lister grew up basically with her uncle's family, and she ended up inheriting it. Isn't that right? Yeah, because her brothers died, and so she actually ended up inheriting it. You couldn't go on site, and that was one of the great frustrations of COVID lockdown, not being able to go on site. But then it opened up this entire world of collaborative research for you, especially with the Irish researcher. What was her name? Shan?
Yeah, there's one particular sort of Anne Lister enthusiast, San Ricken, who lives in the wilds of County Cork in Ireland, and she answered a couple of my queries, and I don't think she realised that she would be in for a full year of me sending her these follow-up queries. By the way, all these people did this in a completely volunteer spirit for free. I wasn't hiring any of them. So for a year during COVID, I would plague San with okay, the girl who was in the bedroom 2 bedrooms over from theirs, do you think she might have been the one whose father had a bank? And basically San managed to establish genealogies and histories for all the kids of their age in the school. So many of the minor characters in my book are only characters at all because San found me some vivid detail, like, Betty's father died halfway through the year, or one particular girl fell off a cliff as a child and her nanny died during that accident. So, she'd find me these riveting little anecdotes which were just enough to start to build a character on. For instance, here's the kind of thing I love about historical sources, that they include things you wouldn't think to make up. So I would never have thought to give Anne Lister and Eliza Reign a lesbian teacher. That would have seemed really unsubtle, But they had one. And I know this because San Ricken found me a letter, the single letter preserved by this particular teacher. She happened to be pen pals with an Irish playwright, Arthur Murphy. So she wrote him a letter describing her new job at the Manor School in York, saying how she and her partner had moved from Hampstead up to Yorkshire for this job, which I think is clearly a hallmark of a marital-style relationship, and describing the school and how it was this big ramshackle set of medieval buildings and that there was a big pig kept in one of the rooms downstairs. I would never have thought to invent a pig in one of their classrooms, but there he was. Or rather she, and there's a gender reveal for the pig. So, yeah, I found these sources so rich and stimulating, and yet because the book is mostly taking place long before Anne Lister started recording her life, of course, there was still lots for me to invent. So it's an ideal situation for historical fiction.
Well, and before we talk more about the book, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the incredible Helena Whitbread, who is really the font of all Anne Lister scholarship.
Yeah, Helena Whitbread is the kind of mother of Lister studies, I would say. It was she who published those first 2 volumes of excerpts from the Anne Lister diaries in the late 80s. And before, others had come across those texts and just been nervous to publish anything from them. So people had done research and then just sort of tucked it away in a box.
But also, Emma, talk about how it was coded in algebraic equations and Greek.
Yeah, Anne Lister was a very smart kid. She'd study a bit with the vicar, learn a bit of Latin and Greek with him. And then so she made herself a code using Latin, Greek, and numbers. Apparently it's not very difficult as codes go, but all codes are equally impenetrable to me. So Helena Whitbread, took me to Shipton Hall and then took me to the archives, and she sort of live translated from the little volume to me, and that was just a thrilling moment. I remember a tiny little corner crumbled off one of the pages as we turned it. Old manuscripts are like that. And I had this overwhelming impulse to swallow it. To include a bit of the Anne Lister diaries in myself.
Ingest Anne
But
Lister.
there were librarians all around me, and I thought my reputation within this community could be mud. I cannot eat a bit of the Anne Lister diaries, but I wanted to so much. So yeah, Helena's fantastic, and she's a self-educated scholar herself, and she just wandered into her local library looking for something to research as a retirement hobby, and one of the local librarians said, "We have this rather interesting collection of unpublished diaries."
I think Helena Whitbread, too, like Anne Lister herself, is probably a polymath. You have to be prodigiously talented to be able to have interpreted those diaries the way she did with such alacrity, right?
Very much so. And also you would expect that if you are the one who gets in early and becomes an expert on something, and then 30 years later, 40 years later, the rest of the world finally catches up and gets interested, you would expect that you'd be a bit kind of surly and a bit of a gatekeeper. Not so. Helena Whitbread has absolutely embraced this worldwide community of fans and enthusiasts and sort of, cheered on younger people like me who were researching particular aspects of the Anne Lister circle. So she's been enormously welcoming to this whole community.
One of the things I'd like you to talk about is the structure of the book. And what happens is we have letters that Eliza has written when she's 24, 25, from a local asylum where she has been living for some time. And those are interspersed with the narrative of the present day of their lives when they first meet in 1805. So maybe talk about that decision.
I did that for 2 reasons. I mean, you know yourself, Janet, that when you're trying to think, how do I represent a life? You have to weigh up how much of it to show and what weight to give the different sections. You don't want something which sort of trawls through a life at the same speed from beginning to end. So I knew that I really wanted to focus on the year they were at school together. But I couldn't ignore the fact that Eliza had this very tragic future. She had a breakdown in her 20s and checked herself into an asylum for help and never left, never got out of there. I think because she was she described herself once as having a widowed, orphaned heart. There was nobody fighting for her. It's not that anybody conspired in the first place. I can find no evidence that anybody said, lock that girl up, or that there was anything overtly racist or homophobic in their impulse, in that she did go to the asylum voluntarily. But I think the fact that she never got out suggests to me that people saw her as, like, more or less inherently unstable. Like, no real surprise that girl, went mad. I think stereotypes about what they would have called an Asiatic temperament definitely fed into people thinking it was kind of natural that she was in the asylum. And above all, because she didn't have a family anymore, nobody was fighting to get her out of there. So anyway, I wanted to respect the truth of Eliza's long-term story, but obviously not have the book be a total downer. So my my compromise was that it's mostly when she's 14, but there are these letters that she writes at 24. And also, another reason I did that was that I wanted the structure of the book to be nostalgic. The opening line is a shout out to the novel Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and that feeling of like being obsessed with a particular place, a particular time that you can never get back to. In Eliza's real surviving letters, she often sounds just obsessively nostalgic, and she'll remember particular songs that meant a lot to them, or poems, or moments. And she writes to Anne at one point saying, it's exactly 8 years since we met. And this kind of harping on the past, I find so sad, because it's as if she had this one glorious year, and she thought because of that she and Anne would be together forever, and this was just the start of their wonderful life together. But actually, they missed their moment. They had to sort of wait around for Eliza to inherit her money at 21. And there's a long stretch between 14 and 21. And so by 21, Anne had moved on and was interested in other women. So I suppose a 10-year frame was my way of trying to capture that brooding, intense nostalgia.
And also, the 1805 section of the narrative is so vibrantly present. You are there with these girls in their attic room. You are there with them when they scratch with one of Eliza's diamonds into the little triangular window pane. You are there with them as they go to classes. Oh, this is something maybe you could talk about too, is the influence of French. The French master is somebody who seems to have a lot of authority in the school. And at that time, we had the war with France, and they weren't sure that Britain was actually going to win. So there's that stress.
This would be an example of the kind of thing that I only include if my main characters would care. So, for instance, when I wrote my first historical novel, Slammerkin, I thought, I'm not going to mention who the king is because my girl doesn't care. But in this case, the schoolgirls would have cared because Britain was in this panic about invasion. There were stories going around that Napoleon had this huge army of hot air balloons, and in French invention, on the French coast, waiting to come over to England and drop down. So there was panic. And I suppose one reason I sort of flag up the Frenchness in the book is that, given that Eliza is very much a child of empire, I thought it was interesting to look at the ways in which Britain, was kind of self-declared center of the world, but actually the British looked to the French as the arbiters of taste and fashion and chic and art and literature. And even when they were at war with them, for as long as these girls had been alive, they were still, learning French in all their schools. Schools in their little ads always boasted the teaching was done through French or partly through French. So it's as if, the British were fetishizing this French culture even as they were afraid of Napoleon. I had fun with that. And of course, I knew that their French teacher would probably have been a refugee as well. Like there were all these émigrés, these royalist French people in Britain eking out a living by teaching French to the schoolgirls.
Spoiled girls, French. Also, it just occurred to me right now that Eliza's seal for wax seal for the letters that she writes is a French phrase.
That's right. A lot of real objects inspired this novel. So we have Eliza's seal, which was in wax, in metal to press on wax, and it says "Pensez à moi," think of me. In that tone of slight, neediness. You can never quite shake me off. That slightly stalkerish tone is characteristic of Eliza, I would say. And the graffiti is also still there on the windows. We don't know which schoolgirl wrote which messages, and they seem to cover centuries. I mean, some of them are specifically 18th century, some 19th century, but there are hundreds of little messages on one particular room in King's Manor in York. And one of them, it says, "With this diamond I cut the glass, with this face I kissed a lass." We don't know who wrote it, but I decided that would be a perfect one to attribute to Anne Lister.
Absolutely. One of the joys of this novel, too, is that it's also a boarding school novel. And although at the time, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, too, Emma, they wouldn't have performed a school play. Most boarding school novels have school plays in them. It's just part of the culture. Here they ended up reading one of Shakespeare's plays and then going to see it. They end up reading As You Like It. And there's a very good reason, I think, that you chose As You Like It. I want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think Shakespeare's cross-dressing plays, and in particular Twelfth Night and As You Like It, they've been central to the idea of, women falling in love with each other by accident and, just for a while and in a safe way, and it's all comic at the end and there'll be a wedding, So I think they've been with their combination of, the beautiful young woman in breeches and the accidental falling in love, I think they've been sort of central to lesbian-themed literature ever since he wrote them. So yeah, at first I was really stumped by how do I include a school play, because in novels like Charlotte Bronte's Villette, say, there are wonderful scenes of school plays, but it was just not credible that you would have one in 1805. You may remember in one of Jane Austen's novels, this little group of, they're young adults, and they put on a play just privately with no audience in their country house, and they still get in major trouble when Papa comes home, So yeah, I thought at least reading a play aloud would be some equivalent of this. But yes, it is very much a boarding school novel, and I tried to keep to the rules of that genre. Like, everything happens at the school. I don't follow them home for holidays. Holidays are just skipped out, because I wanted to really capture that feeling of, nothing is real except what happens in the school. I was very interested, because I knew I would be moving between an asylum and a school. I was very interested in looking at both of those as what they call total institutions, like institutions where there are rules for how you spend every minute of the day, and there are arbitrary and petty rules. And I don't know the particular rules they had at the Manor School, but I read memoirs by many other young women and sort of collected all the best rules. And a lot of these phenomena of boarding schools seem to have lasted well into the late 20th century. My partner went to a boarding school in the 1970s on the Isle of Wight, and they had, say, weekly kind of self-accusation sessions where you'd have to stand up and explain what demerits you had earned for what petty infractions. And then you'd be told you were like 32nd in maths and, 15th in gym. So
humiliation was always a big part of the pedagogy.
Absolutely, and specifically for girls, in boys' schools they were beating them, but in girls' schools they were surveilling them and regulating them and making them ashamed, basically. So there'd be ceremonial punishments, like you could wear the ass's ear or the liar's tongue, or every aspect of the female character was sort of tweaked in this way. So I suppose I was also trying to create a tense setting in which, when love bloomed, it would be all the more of a contrast. Because if every minute of your day is like, I have to do double homework for that teacher, and I mustn't eat too many slices of bread at lunch. And then if you're like sneaking upstairs to your secret lover, I thought it would be a great contrast.
It is a great contrast, and it's also a contrast because Anne Lister herself does not care about any of these punishments. And because she is a polymath, because she is supremely talented in so many ways, she can shrug it all off, because she can compensate for her punishments by rattling off a perfectly memorized passage of poetry.
Yeah, they really fetishized memorization as a skill. So that's one reason the novel is called Learned by Heart. And I suppose also I wanted to suggest that Eliza just sort of can't shake off the memories. She would actually be better off 10 years on, forgetting what happened and moving on with her life, but it's as if it's imprinted on her like wax. So, the pedagogy of girls' schools at the time, it was all about, memorize that half page of Johnson's dictionary. It was incredibly intellectually null, I would say. But I suppose it was kind of amazing these girls were getting formal education at all, given that the tradition had been just, teach them how to cook and marry them off as early as possible. So I suppose it was better than nothing, but it certainly wasn't education by our standards. So yeah, I liked the idea of creating an institution where, there'd be a lot of frustration and irritation and anxiety, but when love bloomed, you would be able to think of nothing else.
And they think of nothing else, and they do nothing else except love each other for great swaths of the book. And it's so beautifully and affectingly written. I think you'll love it if you haven't read the book already. I think you really will love it. One of the fun things that the girls do, they have a school trip to this Cabinet of Curiosities in York. And they see these most astonishing things on display, things that actually exist.
There was a real, cabinet, a sort of wonder cabinet on show at the Sycamore pub in York. I don't know which objects they had there, and so of course I trawled through the archives looking for all the objects put on show around this time. And I would say it was a weird mixture of nature and culture. Like you'd have, gigantic crystal and a, fossilized leaf. And then you would have a kimono or a samurai sword. So lots of kind of, oohing and ahhing over culturally exotic imports. And of course, Eliza Reign would have felt like one of these culturally exotic imports. And one of the things the novel is sort of brooding over, I suppose, or a topic it's chewing over, is whether it's a good or bad thing to be a rarity. Rarity was one of my sort of draft titles for this novel, because Anne Lister was really proud of being different. In her diaries, I think what makes her so sort of proto-modern is that she quite often says things like, I am made like no one else in the world. And, to her, that clearly sounds like a source of pride. But I think if you're, someone who's trying to avoid triggering the racism that's bubbling under the surface of Regency society, you wouldn't think it was such fun to be unlike everybody else. So I think perhaps you have to be very confident and feel very normal in other ways in order to enjoy being different in some ways. They have several conversations about whether it's a good thing to be different or special.
Well, and it's a great tension that you sustain throughout the book about that too, right? Their outsider status and their different approaches to that.
And if you look at Anne and Eliza's lives overall, I would say that Anne really thrived on being different. I mean, she had moments of, say, mortification. There's one moment in her diaries in her 20s when her lover, Marianne, is ashamed of the sight of Anne, like marching up to her carriage, taking big strides. And Anne is really embarrassed that Marianne's embarrassed about her. But I would say generally in the diaries, Anne sounds like, I'm so proud to be me. And so I thought, in her future life, Anne clearly followed that course with enthusiasm. Even though, for instance, the local working class people in Yorkshire resented her political interference. She used to go around and sort of twist their arms to vote for the Tory candidate. She didn't have a vote herself as a woman, but she would basically bully her tenants into voting Conservative. So at one point they burned her in effigy, for instance, or they would put, hoax ads in the newspapers making fun of her masculinity. So, she earned a lot of grief for being unusual, but mostly she seems to have thrived on it. And she did things like opening coal mines or being the first woman to climb various mountains, and she was a hugely ambitious traveller. Whereas Eliza Reign, it very much looks to me like she was quite a conventional person who, fell madly in love with a girl in her teens and therefore, never sort of got back on that conventional track, never got married, never had children, and ended up in the asylum. So it's a fascinating study of kind of the pros and cons of going off the beaten track.
Right. And soon we'll be opening up to questions that you might have for Emma. But of all the research that you did, what delighted you most, do you think? There's so many delights, but talk about one thing maybe that delighted you.
It's funny, this isn't a discovery. It's just I needed some information on how they would have spent their leisure time. So I read a lot about parlor games. But then I would also ask my 14-year-old when she came home, what kind of games you guys play. And I found there were all these sort of continuities between teenage life then and now, because a lot of the games are really about, do you understand what the game is? Or making the one newcomer in the group feel stupid because they don't realize how the game is played. These kind of mechanisms of making somebody feel like the
politics
idiot.
of it. Well, especially teenaged girl politics, which are so toxic.
Well,
right?
It's not that they're always toxic. I think there's a huge amount of, loving support too, but they pay a huge amount of attention to social relations. I mean, I have very typical boy and girl in that way, in that our son will come home and I'd be like, how was your day? And he's, fine. And our daughter will come home and do microanalysis of who sat where and who thought what. So yeah, I think that the social realm is often very important for girls, put it that way. So I think writing a boarding school book about boys would be a very different thing. Have we time for a page?
We have time for a page? Okay.
Yes, okay.
Oh, you've got your page there?
I do. This is from the very first letter that Eliza writes to Anne. In the night I send out my mind to roam, and of all the places I've lived in my almost quarter century, Madras, Tottenham, Doncaster, Halifax, Bristol, the lodestone to which my restless mind is always drawn as a compass needle to true north is York, and in particular to our manor school. Less than a mile in distance from the house where I sit scribbling now, but in time a yawning gulf, 10 years back to when we were 14. And not just any 10 years, but that vast stretch between raw girlhood and settled womanhood. Like some old lady at 24, I find most fascination in retrospect. The memories come back to me with the irresistible force of waves striking a shore. It would be absurd to deny how changed I am. In ways I need not list, I am not what I was when we met. But I recall that Eliza so vividly, I only have to close my eyes to slip into her, under her skin. Under the mossy, leaky roof of King's Manor, I was quickened to life from the day I first laid eyes on you, Lister. As the old Roman chiseled on the stone there, happy the spirit of this place. In our slope, I passed my best hours, and sometimes I have to remind myself that they are indeed past. But I tell myself that I'm not dead, not yet. Wilted plants have been known to revive if given just a little water. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and have a good evening.